Hi, we continue in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 4, verse 14, where we hear this. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And with this proclamation from Isaiah 61, Jesus announces that his ministry in Galilee will be about Jubilee. And so if you're not familiar with Jubilees, we're going to go over that a little bit here, both in its roots in the Hebrew Scripture and in its aspects of what Sue and I like to call in our ministry the 4 Ds of Jubilee, which you can see on the right side of the screen: debt, disease, demons, and death. So let's look at this a little bit. Let's go back to the beginning of our section here and note something just from my notes here from 4:14 to 9:50, the introduction of this section, because after 9:50 we get the long 11-chapter journey to Jerusalem from 9:51 all the way to chapter 19. So what about this section? Unlike the Gospel of Mark with its discipleship catechism at the center, or Matthew with its parallel sets of triple healings, Luke doesn't structure it quite that way. And as Joel Green, who has a major commentary on it on Luke's Gospel, notes, there is no straightforward narrative structure. Instead, this narrative section is teeming with the complexities of interactive narrative cycles, and is balanced between proclamation and what he calls miracle working, both serving as manifestations of the good news, designated as integral to Jesus' mission, and both attracting response. There is no way to predetermine how one will respond, nor do all of one group respond in a typical way, which is key to a theme that we looked at the very beginning of Luke. The Luke doesn't have just one message about money and one message about disease. He, like a good doctor or a good social analyst, determines what's actually going on with given people or given individuals in their context. So we'll see that as we go through all of Luke. But rather than look at this in terms of a structure of how the text is shaped, we'd like to look at it how it's all shaped around Jubilee. Because Luke putting this passage right at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, and this is his first public act. So far he's been baptized, and he had the private experience of the voice from the sky, and then he was out in the wilderness chatting with the devil about his mission, but now is the first time he's been in public. And so, although it's alluded to in Nazareth, do the same things you did in Capernaum, we haven't seen that happen. So here's the beginning of his ministry, and this proclamation from Isaiah 61 has been lying there waiting to be fulfilled, and Jesus says, today it is fulfilled, which is to say it's his business to be doing this. If it wasn't for the fact that it's become such a hackneyed phrase, we might suggest it's his mission statement. But since mission statements are often statements that are left there and not gone on mission, they just become statements, that's not really a good way to put it. Perhaps another way to put it is that this is Jesus' announcement of God's hold on him and what he hopes to share as the good news with others, the way the reign of God will be manifest on earth as it is in the sky. So let's look at 2 things. Let's look at the background in Hebrew Scripture, let's look at the 4 Ds of Jubilee, and maybe 3 things and a couple of examples of how people are continuing this ministry today. So, in Hebrew Scripture, there are several main passages. We see here from Isaiah 61, and these are excerpts, the one that Jesus goes to there. And I want to note right away that Luke has him read this much of it right up to here, but leaves off, "and the day of vengeance of our God," which will come back later in Luke at the very end. It's not that Jesus doesn't recognize that there is a day of vengeance. It's just not this day when the Scripture is fulfilled. It will be way later in Luke's Gospel. But Isaiah 61 itself is almost certainly building on the tradition in Leviticus. And if you're not familiar with the tradition in Leviticus, I encourage you to read it, as well as to consider one of the several wonderful books that have shaped my and many other people's views about Jubilee in Luke's Gospel and beyond. And if you want some introduction to this in a practical way, you do know better than Ross and Gloria Kinsler's classic, The Biblical Jubilee and the Struggle for Life, published by Orbis Books. Like all of my books and so many colleagues in this kind of work, just before the year 2000, just before the biblical Jubilee, or rather the secular Jubilee of the year 2000, where many people are expecting a major change, and secular groups called for Jubilee around the world for release of debt in very heavily indebted nations. But the Kinzler's work comes out of their longstanding work in Latin America, which influenced many people, a couple of whom we'll look at a little later in this video. But their book really set the stage for recovering this biblical process of Jubilee, a process of release and liberation for the earth and for all people. So in Leviticus, it's expressed as a year. 7 times 7 years, you count out, in the 50th year is the Jubilee. You shall have the trumpet sounded loud, which is really the meaning of the word Yuval in Hebrew, which is the sounding of the trumpet to call people home. And so the trumpet here is the Yuval. It's a little different than the word shofar, which we see like in some other texts about blowing the shofar. So the blowing of the trumpet sounding through the land, you shall hallow the 50th year, and in that year you shall engage in no agriculture. Everybody, all debts are released, and everybody returns to their own property. So the idea that property is a permanent possession, as we understand in a capitalist real estate world, is utterly foreign to the Bible and certainly to the Jubilee position, because as we hear often in the Bible, the earth is mine, says Yahweh, you are but tenants. And so recovering that sense that the earth belongs to God, that God allows us to use it for our purpose of thriving, but not to abuse it. So as part of that process, it gets a rest. Every 7 years there's a sabbatical, and every sabbatical of sabbaticals there's a Jubilee. And we see smaller versions of that in Deuteronomy 15. It's hard to say which text came first, but you can see here in Deuteronomy 15 the sabbatical year, every 7 years. And both Leviticus and Deuteronomy make a point of saying, don't be tight-fisted or hard-hearted toward your needy neighbor. Don't be saying, I'm not going to make a deal in the 6th year because in the 7th year debts are going to be released, but come with a spirit of generosity and love for your neighbor, who is your brother or sister or other form of sibling in God. And so Deuteronomy 15 and Leviticus lay out some of the details. Isaiah 61 assumes that readers know that by simply referring to the year of the Lord's favor, implying all the aspects of Jubilee. Another aspect of Jubilee that's important to note, and I don't have it here, but you can look it up for yourself, of course, is that in Leviticus 26, it gives a long list of the wonderful things that will happen if people practice Jubilee. Their new crop will come in before their old crops are over, and they'll live in peace, and everyone will get along. But if you don't, it will gradually become hell on earth. And I really want to underscore that, because that's a message and a theme that continues in Luke. Not that if you don't practice Jubilee according to Leviticus, you'll go to hell when you die, or your soul will go to hell when you die, but it will become hell. In other words, earth will become uninhabitable, become a wasteland of fighting and violence and struggle, because people have not maintained it and given it the rest and refreshment that it and we and all creatures need. So Jesus is making that, according to Luke, the center of his public ministry, and framing it here around not just the year of the Lord's favor, but all these other aspects, which are all parts of Jubilee, to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release, literally, letting go of, the same word that's used for forgiveness. So forgiveness is a form of Jubilee, as well as literal release from captivity. Recovery of sight to the blind, which is, of course, not exclusive of recovery of hearing to the deaf, recovery of walking to the lame, etc. To let the oppressed go free, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. In other words, the proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor is like a summary of doing all these other things. And so let's look at that here in terms of what the 4 Ds of Jubilee as we see it here. The traditional aspect of Jubilee was debt, the release of debt every 7 years and the return to the land. But Luke's Jesus incorporates all aspects of Jubilee. So let's just look at briefly and see how most of these take place within this section in chapter 4 through chapter 9 before the journey to Jerusalem. So we see for debt 3 aspects of that here, and we see this one here in chapter 7, Simon at the home of Simon the Pharisee, Jesus at the home of Simon the Pharisee, and proclaiming forgiveness and release to this woman. Disease comes up almost immediately after the scene with the healing of the fever of Peter's mother-in-law, and we see several summaries in this section of Jesus' healing ministry, all in terms of the 4 Ds of Jubilee. We'll see it in terms of healing the centurion's son, also in this section, and authorizing his disciples to heal disease as well. And then the healing ministry continues later on in these passages. Similarly with demons, we haven't encountered demons as such, we've encountered the devil, and we'll talk more about demons in Luke when we get to this passage, but you see again almost immediately right after here, including in the same section as Peter's mother-in-law casting out the unclean demon from the synagogue, as well as casting out 7 demons from Mary Magdalene, who's not a prostitute, but that we'll get to there when we get there. And we see further exorcisms of demons here in this section, again, including authorizing the disciples to do it. So as he authorized them to heal diseases, he also authorizes them to cast out demons. And notice how almost all of these are within this section before the journey to Jerusalem. And then finally, of death, raising the dead son of the widow of Nain. And again, in this section, not later on. As, for example, in John's Gospel, where the raising of Lazarus is the final act in the book of signs, the first half of John's Gospel, just before the Last Supper and the Last Supper discourse. Here it's incorporated into the first part of Luke's Gospel here as an expression of Jesus' proclamation of Jubilee in this section. So that's what we're going to see in this section. Let's look just briefly at what this looks like in real life, because if this excites you, as it excites many people, there are many places to jump right in. So I already mentioned Ross and Gloria Kinsler's book, and here's a place that's inspired by that with our friend Lee Van Ham in San Diego, One Earth Jubilee. And as it says right at the beginning of their description of what they are, they started after reading the book by Ross and Gloria Kinsler. The influence of Latin America has been integral from our start, and they focus on Jubilee circles. Here's a picture of Lee's book on Jubilee circles in Chiapas, Mexico, San Mateo, Mexico, and in San Diego, California. And you can see the map of that there. So this connecting across the wealthy country here and the less wealthy areas down there as Jubilee circles. So that's one place you can do that. Or you can be in the newly formed Center for Jubilee Practice, which features as their leadership team the Reverend Ashley Dattar-Burt and the long-standing activist Rick Ufford Chase, both out of the Presbyterian tradition here. So they're just getting going, also inspired by the Kinslers and others, working with folks also in the Arizona borderlands, so also working internationally with Latin American folks. And then finally, for now, but not finally in the scheme of things, because there are many, many people doing this kind of work, is the work of our friend Ched Myers and his partner Elaine Enns, and you can see their picture here. And just as I was gathering these resources, I see that they're announcing the version 1.5 of this now classic book on Sabbath economics that Ched wrote, The Biblical Vision of Sabbath Economics, again inspired by the Kinslers, who've been friends of theirs for so long, and their Bartimaeus Kinsler Institute is their regular gathering of folks who are supportive of this kind of work. So all three of these are doing this kind of work in practical ways, both from inspired by Luke's Gospel and from the Kinslers' work, and by other activists doing this kind of thing, as well as the fact that experiencing this kind of life leads to good news, to release debts, to heal people of unclean spirits that they're possessed by, to heal them of illnesses, feels good, right? It brings joy, and it manifests love, and it makes people be grateful for life. So it's not, the reward isn't that you go to heaven when you die any more than the threat is you go to hell when you die, but you experience a life full of joy and generosity and peace and kindness and compassion. So that's the vision of biblical Jubilee that Jesus announces at the beginning of his ministry here. Not surprisingly, it won't be fully embraced. There'll be much resistance because the status quo is strong, and the powers that be that have created a status quo that favors them are not going to take this easily. So Jesus will face into conflicting winds as he attempts to break things up by practicing Jubilee, including among his own disciples. But that's where the great drama of the gospel carries itself out as people struggle to receive the message and person of Jesus truly as good news that is liberating from empire. And we'll see how that goes in the very first scene next time. See you then. Bye-bye.